Hi everybody, it's David here, and time for another video. In my last video I promised you a sort of uh, showcase of what I have done in terms of the 15mm stuff that I was talking about in the last video. I talked about the DBA and the stuff that I still have left to paint. Well, this is the rather modest collection of painted 15mm figures that I have. Kind of everything you see ahead of you that's not World War II related, so this is everything pre-World War II. And I just wanted to show you, what I have and how that dovetails with what I showed you in the little lead pile that I have, and then I wanted to quickly chat about, you know, uh, how I came to collect these things as they are right now. So one of the things I talked about in my last video was my collecting proclivities in the early 2000s, and a lot of that was revolved around DBA. Now if you look here, this section here, I'll zoom the camera in, so forgive the camera for being a bit wobbly. It's obviously I'm not a professional cameraman and this is not a super sophisticated camera, so we'll do our best here. But here you have a early Imperial Roman army. These are all SX miniatures, 15mm as I said earlier. And the principle here was I bought the DBA armies, like I said in my last video, because they were sort of discrete units that you could, you could buy like a DBA army, and you'd have something you could play with, and then you could always add stuff to it as time went on. So here you can see three bases of cavalry, one of which is a general. So you can have your general as either a cavalry, or you can have him as a blade unit, and then four bases of legionaries behind him, and then four units of auxilia, which are the sort of in the front. These blue ones are Marines. I did them with Marines with the rather snazzy, let me see if I can zoom in and show you that transfer there, the cool Neptune trident thing for their shields. Very animated poses. And then at the back I just did sort of green auxiliaries, much more sort of standardized colors. Then at the back you've got some archers and an artillery piece, a ballista, which I'll just show you quickly. It's a cool little, these artillery pieces are pretty fun to do because they give you the opportunity to do like a little, it's a bit more dynamic than just guys who are ranked up. Now this isn't particularly special, I didn't do anything wild and wacky with it, but I think if I were to in the future I would probably try and make it a bit more interesting looking. Again, this is my early wargaming days, so you've got to forgive the sort of simplicity of the paint jobs and stuff. This was not sophisticated. And then here we have some Numidian archers, which were what Essex gave you as the skirmishing unit for this early Imperial Roman army. You also got a unit of light cavalry, or light horse, and that was one of these Numidian horse bases back here that you can see. So that was the nascence, the beginning, if you will, of my 15mm army. And here you can see some hoplites, some Greek hoplites, minus their spears, because those that's the last piece that needs to be done there. They just need to be glued on, and they're quite fiddly, and I just haven't got round to that yet. But I do have the actual spears themselves. So these are done. You can see they're rather shiny transfers, look ridiculous, but whatever. But they're done pretty much. Basing and everything is finished. And that was from that later hoplite army that I described in my last video. Excuse the camera for bouncing around. The tripods had seen better days. The principle here was that I would create this DBA army of Greeks that I could then bolt onto my Carthaginian force for like a first Punic War army. And then you have more Numidian horse. So some of these here were actually from the Carthaginian, for a Carthaginian army as the DBA options, like I mentioned in the last video. Numidians are really fun to paint. People think of them as rather boring and dull, but I actually find them quite therapeutic to do. You can do a little bit of color in them, which is interesting, but you have the unifying shields, which look really great. So you can see here that I've opted for sort of black and brown cowhide patterning because it just looks cool, right? Then we have the amazing elephants at the back. No one should leave home without an elephant if you're a Carthaginian player, I think, or even a Numidian player, because little forest elephants were used in their armies as well. Here's the first one, which was, I just did him in red, and then the second I did with a cool kind of stripe down the side, as you can see there. And elephants are really fun to paint, and I've committed the cardinal sin of painting them grey, but I think at this distance, grey is actually an appropriate colour. I realise that elephants are kind of a more of a browny kind of colour, but whatever. Who's counting, right? Here are miniatures that might look familiar, or not familiar, but at least or you might recognise rather. These are Libyan javelinmen, right? So skirmishers. Now the unit on the right, the 4 bases on the right here, these are the ones I did many years ago with black and white shields, and then the one on the left is the, you may recognize from the Weekend Warrior video in which I showed you how I painted them. So they actually look fantastic together, and I think given that this unit was probably painted 15 or almost 20 years ago now, and the time difference between them, I think they actually match quite nicely. And again, that's one of the benefits of 15mm, because your stylistic changes in painting are probably less exaggerated at this scale, because you know the miniatures are simply smaller. Let me pull these out of the way. I've got a few bits and pieces hanging around in the front here. I just want to get them out of the way so you can see. These are now the Carthaginians. Now again, I said last time that I worked around a DBA composition. So here's my cavalry mounted general. You can see him there in his purple cloak. He still has 2 eyes, so presumably this is either not Hannibal or a young Hannibal. And then another cavalry unit at the rear, and then a whole bunch of spear units. So we have 3 units of Libyan spear, Libyan-Phoenician spear at the back, and then at the front we have a unit of Carthaginian citizen infantry, which DBA classes as auxilia. So yeah, really these were the less so the citizen infantry, but the Libyan-Phoenician spearmen were quite fun to paint. And what I'll do is try and demonstrate what I mean here. They're single casting pieces, which means that the shields are attached. Let me tilt this down and show you what I mean. So the spears are cast to the figures, and as are the shields. And the nice thing about that is that you don't have the same problem you have with the Greeks I showed you earlier, which is that of assembly, right? These ones were just really fun. You can smatter some colors on them. They look great. You can put color variations on them, but they still look like a single unit, right? Because the helmets help to tie them together, and the pose obviously is relatively uniform, or it's exactly uniform. Now, in my last video, you also would have seen some French ordnance stuff that was unpainted. Well, back when I was toying with the notion of doing that, I actually started painting up some pike units that came with the unit, with the DBA army, and this I just chose 2 Swiss cantons as the start of that. I don't remember which is which, but I chopped these pikes short, one of them, to use as a flagstaff, standard, and that you can see that here. Now, at some point, like I mentioned, I'll probably work on that French ordnance army, but I also completed some crossbowmen, which you can see here, and some bowmen. These are skirmish units, and you know, I figured they were French, so blue was an appropriate color, and then white, because blue and white seemed very French, and I needed another color, and yellow seemed appropriate. I don't know why, I just chose it. I thought it was a good color combination, and that's what I did. And they look quite good actually, and you can see I've put some sand on these. I was actually in the process of basing these up recently. Most of the 15mm stuff that you see at the back there has actually been based quite recently. I just went on a sort of basing binge, really. It's something really fun you can do when you're watching the cricket or something. You can have the cricket on in the background, you know, especially the tests, watching the Ashes or whatever, and you could just do basing, you know, because there's a lot of waiting time between things drying and so on, and it's not as demanding in terms of dexterity as actual painting, right? So I think the bases on those ancients look fantastic. I think they look really good. Very happy with how they came out, so that's a massive positive there. So yeah, I'm quite happy with the way that those 2 DBA armies shook out, and like I said, the nice thing about them is they then have the capacity to grow by simply bolting on more. Then here is my rather paltry Fire and Fury 15mm Confederate army. So in the back row here we have standing infantry, so there's a command in the center, and then we have some rather ragged looking Confederates with stolen blue trousers to either side of them, and then what I did was I did a bunch of firing line figures as well, so you can see them. Let me try and zoom in and you can get a sense of them. Now bear in mind, again, this stuff was painted probably, well, around 20 odd years ago, so you know, we're not expecting these to be the best painted figures in the world, but I think the bases look okay, especially with the like grey stones that I did, which I think only added to the sort of grey uniforms of the Confederates to give it a unifying tone. You know, because they otherwise look quite ragged, but the grey manages to tie them together, I think. The grey and the blue, really. But yeah, they look pretty sharp, actually. I was quite happy with how they turned out. And again, considering that this is, in my painting journey, that this represents work from my relatively early days, I'm actually quite satisfied with how they've held up. And again, I think part of that has to do with the way that 15mm paints up. I think it's very forgiving as a scale. I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in wargaming. I mean, 28mm is obviously what I would say is probably the gold standard aesthetically. It looks great, it paints up really nice. It's probably a little bit easier to paint in the sense of it's just a larger surface. But I think when you consider something like this command stand here, I mean, you know, this didn't take me too long to paint, and I think it looks pretty good. So yeah, anyway, that's the beginnings of a Fire and Fury army. And you saw in the last video what's left to do there, and what I basically done when I started this was I just simply gone through the packs of infantry and just decided, okay, well, what do we need here is we need lots and lots of men with muskets, and so I did men with muskets and a couple of command units, command bases to go with them. There wasn't really any plan of a specific battle or anything like that, so I think the flags I've chosen are just whatever I sort of like the look of, and I picked that. I don't know if I like those flags, and I may replace them because they look kind of chunky and a bit rubbish, to be honest. But we'll worry about that another day. For the moment, the key thing is just that, you know, they are painted and they are done. So that's really handy. So again, not setting the world on fire with this rather small collection, but I think I guess my point is I wanted to show you know, that even though you may have your giant pile of stuff that feels like it's never ending, it's actually quite easy, especially using something like DBA or arranging your work around brigade or divisions to have discrete collections that are actually functional in many ways, where you can combine things to grow them. So looking at, for instance, what's the nascent Carthaginian collection here can combine with the later Hoplite Greeks, or even fight the later Hoplite Greeks. Plus there's the beginnings of a Numidian DBA army there. And again, the nice thing is that you've got the early Imperials there who could likely utilize a lot of the Numidian stuff as sort of allied infantry, as auxiliaries or whatever in North Africa. If you just simply use the Numidians as Moors or something like that from a slightly later period. So there it is. That's my 50mm collection as of now. Not World War II. I've got a little bit more of that going on, so maybe one day I'll show you that. I just wanted to make this video because I talked about it in my last, but also this will be my last video for a little while. I'm off to Japan for a couple of weeks with work, and so obviously I'll take a hiatus from the hobby in the meantime. I'll still be watching people's videos and obviously thinking a lot about the hobby. And I still am toying with this notion of doing a video about hobbying on the road, in the sense of what to do when you're not actually painting figures, right? Because I think a lot of what happens in our hobby happens in the margins. It's not at the painting table, it's not at the gaming table, oftentimes it's what's happening in between those periods of time, the thinking, the planning, the ideas we gain, the planning around, like, okay, well, you know, like with this ACW stuff, thinking to yourself, okay, handy dandy, you've got this stuff, but what are you building towards, right? And I think that's kind of that has value. So maybe I'll do a video about that. Maybe I'll even make it in Japan, who knows. Point is, I'm off to Japan for a couple of weeks. Hopefully it'll be a good work trip. I'm going to get some downtime there, so I'll make the most of that. I get to visit Osaka and Kyoto this time, which I didn't get to do last time. I was more in the north of the country, and also Tokyo. So this time around, hopefully I'll get a good opportunity to see some other stuff, castle-y bits and pieces like that. Anyway, that is all for now, and I hope you have a wonderful time, and I'll see you when I get back.